Picture it, a man in a torn tuxedo, kneeling on white marble, garbage sliding off his shoulders, while 200 people in evening wear point their phones at him instead of helping him up. Nobody in that ballroom knew his last name. That was the whole point. For 6 years, Yemi had let his wife and her father believe he was nothing, a modest analyst who'd married up, tolerated more out of pity than respect. What Enola never bothered to ask, and what Timmy never bothered to check, was whose money was quietly keeping their company's lights on. The private equity firm they'd spent the entire Gala trying to charm wasn't a stranger's fund. It was his father's, and by morning, it would be his. Enola thought she was disciplining an embarrassment. She was actually serving eviction papers to herself. What happens when the family that humiliates you doesn't just lose an argument, but loses everything they own? If you want to see exactly how Yemi takes it all back, subscribe and turn on notifications. I post stories like this every week, and you don't want to miss the look on Enola's face when she realizes whose name is on the deed 6 years earlier. Yemi made a decision that would define, and nearly destroy, the next chapter of his life. He decided to disappear, not literally. He kept his face, his name, even his social security number. What he buried was the rest of it. The penthouse he grew up in, the private jet his father used like a rental car, the trust fund that could have bought Timmy's entire firm in cash without denting the principal. Yemi wanted something his father's money couldn't manufacture, a life earned instead of inherited. So he took an entry-level analyst position at a mid-tier property management company, rented a one-bedroom apartment 40 minutes from the office, and told no one who he really was. It was there he met Enola. She was sharp, magnetic, and utterly convinced she was destined for more than her father's mid-tier firm could offer her. Yemi found her ambition attractive at first, a mirror, almost, of the drive he'd hidden inside himself. He proposed after 18 months. He should have noticed, in hindsight, how quickly her affection cooled once she understood his salary wasn't going to change. Timmy, her father and the company's CEO, treated Yemi the way he treated most junior employees, as furniture, competent furniture, occasionally useful furniture, but furniture nonetheless. At family dinners, Timmy made a habit of asking Yemi pointed questions about mortgage rates and cap tables, then answering them himself before Yemi could finish a sentence. A small, practiced humiliation, disguised as conversation. Enola rarely defended him. More often, she joined in, calling him sweet in the tone people use for things that don't threaten them. She complained to her friends about marrying a man with no real trajectory. She complained to her father that she deserved someone who could actually keep pace with the family's standing. Yemi heard about most of these conversations second-hand, through the thin walls of dinner parties, and said nothing. He told himself it was patience. He told himself that if he could just be ordinary long enough, he might finally understand what ordinary people got to feel, loved for nothing in particular, rather than for what they could provide. What Yemi didn't yet know was that patience has a shelf life, and Timmy's company had already exceeded its own. Behind the framed award certificates and the marble-floored lobby, the firm was buried in leveraged debt, propped up by refinancing deals that were quietly coming due. Nobody in the building knew it yet. Yemi, with a finance degree from a school he'd never mentioned and an instinct he couldn't fully suppress, was about to be the first. It started with a spreadsheet nobody else wanted to touch. 3 months before the Gala, a routine audit landed on Yemi's desk, the kind of grinding, unglamorous task junior analysts got stuck with, because no one senior wanted to spend a weekend reconciling accounts receivable. Yemi didn't mind. He'd always found comfort in numbers. They didn't perform for him, didn't perform at him. They simply were what they were. What they were, in this case, was alarming. Timmy's company had refinanced its primary credit line 18 months earlier, using projected revenue from 3 commercial developments that were, according to the permits office, still stalled in zoning. The debt covenants required minimum liquidity thresholds the company hadn't met in 2 consecutive quarters. Someone, Yemi suspected Timmy himself, had been quietly reclassifying short-term liabilities to make the balance sheet presentable for the board. It wasn't fraud, not exactly. It was the kind of aggressive optimism that turned into fraud if left alone long enough. Yemi did what he thought any responsible employee would do. He wrote a memo, careful, unemotional, footnoted, and requested 15 minutes with Timmy to walk through the numbers before the next board meeting. He got the 15 minutes. He did not get a hearing. Timmy skimmed the memo for exactly as long as it took to find the conclusion, then slid it back across the desk without finishing it. "You've been here 2 years," he said. "I've been doing this for 30. I don't need a mortgage analyst telling me how to run a real estate company." He said the word mortgage like it tasted bad. Yemi tried once more, gently, to explain that the liquidity covenant breach wasn't a matter of experience but of math. Timmy's expression didn't change, but something behind it did. He told Yemi to focus on his own workload and let the adults handle strategy. Then he mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that Enola had said Yemi seemed stressed lately, as if concern for the company's solvency were a personality flaw to be managed rather than a warning to be heeded. That night, Enola asked why he looked so tired. When he started to explain, she cut him off halfway through the first sentence. "My father's been doing this since before you were born," she said. "Maybe just trust him." Yemi trusted the numbers instead. He didn't raise it again, but he started paying closer attention to invoices, to board minutes he wasn't technically supposed to see, to the increasingly urgent tone of emails between Timmy and the company's outside counsel. He recognized the shape of what was coming, because his father's firm had orchestrated the exact same collapse in a dozen other companies, a business drowning quietly, dressing itself up for one last desperate audience of investors before the water closed over its head. He just didn't yet know that the audience Timmy was dressing up for was his own father. The company's annual gala was, by design, a performance. Every year, Timmy rented the same gold-trimmed ballroom downtown, hired the same string quartet, and invited the same rotating cast of investors, vendors, and mid-level executives who needed to believe the firm was thriving. This year, the performance had higher stakes than usual. A private equity fund, represented, as far as anyone could tell, by a single soft-spoken associate who asked unusually specific questions, had expressed interest in acquiring the company's distressed debt. If the deal closed on favorable terms, it would buy Timmy another 18 months of runway. If it fell through, the liquidity covenant Yemi had flagged months earlier would trigger a default clause buried on page 40 of a credit agreement almost nobody at the company had actually read. Timmy needed this room to believe the company was healthy. He needed it more than he'd admitted to anyone, including Enola. Yemi arrived already knowing what Timmy didn't, that the fund's associate reported, several layers up an org chart, to Peter, his father. Yemi hadn't engineered the coincidence. Distressed commercial debt was a small world, and his father's firm specialized in exactly this kind of quiet acquisition. Yemi had simply chosen, for the first time in years, not to warn anyone. He wanted to see how the night played out honestly, without his intervention smoothing anything over. He watched Enola work the room in her yellow gown, laughing at things that weren't funny, touching investors lightly on the arm the way she'd been coached to. He watched Timmy corner the fund's associate near the bar, overselling the third-quarter numbers with the fluency of a man who'd rehearsed the pitch in a mirror. Yemi didn't approach either of them. He'd learned, slowly and at some cost, that his opinion wasn't wanted at events like this. Only his attendance, as proof that Enola had a husband presentable enough to bring. It was Timmy who approached him, later, drink in hand, jaw tight. Someone from the audit committee had mentioned, in passing, that Yemi had raised liquidity concerns months earlier. Timmy wanted to know, quietly and with real menace beneath the pleasant tone, whether Yemi intended to say anything to their potential buyer tonight. Yemi said only that the numbers spoke for themselves, and that he hoped, sincerely, that Timmy had already disclosed the covenant breach to the fund's people directly. It was the wrong answer, not because it was inaccurate, because it made clear, for the first time in public, that Yemi actually understood what was happening. Timmy's face changed. He walked back toward Enola and said something low into her ear. 2 minutes later, someone wheeled a catering bin toward the center of the dance floor. Nobody handed Yemi a napkin. Nobody offered to walk him out. He picked himself up off the marble alone, while phones kept recording and the string quartet, mercifully or obliviously, kept playing. He didn't look for Enola on his way out. He already knew what he'd find if he did. That satisfied, performative outrage she wore when she believed she'd won something. He walked past the coat check without stopping for his jacket, out through the gold-trimmed lobby doors and into the cold air of the parking garage, still wearing most of a catering bin's contents on his shoulders. He sat in his car for 11 minutes before he started the engine, not crying, not shaking, just sitting with the particular, unfamiliar quiet of a decision finally making itself. He drove to the penthouse he hadn't visited in 4 years. The doorman recognized him immediately, despite the state of his suit, and said nothing about it, a small mercy, or perhaps simply good training. Yemi rode the elevator up in silence, let himself in with a key he'd never had removed from his ring, and stood for a moment in an entryway larger than his and Enola's entire apartment. He called his father at 11:40 p.m. Peter picked up on the second ring, the way he always had, as though he'd been waiting years for this exact call, and refused to let it show. Yemi didn't lead with an apology, and Peter didn't ask for one. He simply said, "I need to come back," and Peter said, "I know," in a tone that suggested he'd known for longer than Yemi had. They talked for 2 hours. Peter didn't gloat, which Yemi had half expected and almost resented not receiving. Some part of him wanted the fight, wanted his father to say, "I told you so," so he'd have something to push against. Instead, Peter asked careful, precise questions about the company, about the covenant breach, about the fund's associate who'd been quietly circling Timmy's debt for weeks. Yemi answered all of them in the same flat, clinical voice he'd used to write the memo Timmy never finished reading. By 2 a.m., Peter had pulled up the fund's file on Timmy's firm himself. By 2:15, he'd confirmed what Yemi had already suspected. The associate at the Gala worked for him. The acquisition Timmy was gambling his company's survival on wasn't a lifeline from a stranger. It was Yemi's family closing in, and it had been for weeks. "You could still let it go easy on him," Peter said, not quite a question. Yemi thought about the marble floor, the laughter, Enola's voice announcing his worthlessness to a room of strangers with the practiced cruelty of someone who'd rehearsed it. "No," Yemi said. "Rewrite the terms." By 8 the next morning, Yemi was no longer an analyst at a mid-tier property firm. He was vice chairman of Voss Capital Partners, his father's fund, sitting in a glass conference room he hadn't set foot in since business school, reviewing a term sheet that hadn't existed 12 hours earlier. The original deal Timmy's board had been expecting was straightforward, almost generous, a debt-for-equity restructuring that would let the fund absorb the company's bad loans in exchange for a minority stake, buying Timmy another 18 months, and a face-saving press release about strategic partnership. It was the kind of deal a distressed company prays for. It was also, Yemi now understood, never something Timmy deserved. He and Peter's legal team spent the morning rewriting it. The new structure was subtler and considerably less generous. Instead of purchasing the debt directly, Voss Capital would acquire it through a shell entity, then immediately call the covenant breach Yemi had flagged months earlier, a breach Timmy had never disclosed to the fund, which itself constituted a material misrepresentation under the terms of any new agreement. That single omission gave Yemi's lawyers a clean, ironclad trigger, a full asset liquidation clause, replacing the soft restructuring Timmy believed he was walking into. There was nothing dramatic about the mechanism. No hacking, no threats, no confrontation. Just 4 attorneys, 4 laptops, and a document that would look, to anyone without a finance background, almost identical to the deal Timmy expected. The only difference was buried in Section 9, subsection C, language dense enough that a confident man in a hurry to celebrate might skim right past it. Yemi made sure Timmy would be in a hurry. He had the fund's associate, the same soft-spoken woman from the Gala, deliver the term sheet personally, with a note suggesting the offer was time-sensitive and needed signatures by Friday to lock in the current valuation. It wasn't a lie, it was simply a fact, presented with enough urgency to discourage careful reading. Peter watched his son work through the afternoon without commentary, which was, for Peter, its own kind of pride. At one point he asked whether Yemi wanted to be in the room when the papers were signed, or whether he'd rather stay behind the scenes entirely. Yemi thought about it longer than the question probably warranted. "I want to be in the room," he said. "I want to watch him read it and not understand what he's reading." Peter almost smiled. And Enola? Yemi didn't answer right away. He was still working out, privately, how much of what came next was business, and how much of it was something closer to grief. "Send her a copy too," he said finally. "Attorney drafted. She'll want to read it carefully this time." The term sheet arrived at Timmy's office on Wednesday morning, hand-delivered in a leather portfolio that looked expensive enough to be reassuring. Timmy read the cover page twice, then called Enola into his office before he'd made it past the executive summary. "They're rescuing us," he told her, and for the first time in months, he looked 10 years younger. Enola read it too, or rather skimmed it the way she skimmed most things, for tone, not substance. The tone was generous, favorable valuation, continuity of management, a partnership, the language suggested, rather than a takeover. She didn't linger on Section 9. Nobody had taught her to look for the section where the real terms of a deal usually hide, tucked between boilerplate definitions and indemnification clauses that read like static. Their outside counsel, a semi-retired attorney Timmy kept on retainer mostly for continuity and cost, reviewed the document in 90 minutes and pronounced it standard for a distressed refinancing. He did not flag the covenant breach disclosure clause, which required Timmy to certify, under penalty of clawback, that he had disclosed all known liquidity issues to the buyer prior to signing. He had not disclosed them. Everyone in the room knew, on some level, that he had not disclosed them. Nobody said so out loud. By Thursday evening, Timmy was celebrating with a bottle of wine older than his marriage. He told Enola this was proof, finally, of everything he'd always believed about himself. That instinct and 30 years of relationships mattered more than spreadsheets, more than the nervous junior analysts who thought a memo could teach him his own business. Enola, buoyed by his mood, allowed herself to feel something like relief for the first time in weeks. She'd spent the gala performing confidence she didn't feel, certain the whole company was about to collapse under her father and take her career down with it. Now it looked like she'd been wrong to worry. She even mentioned, lightly, that Yemi hadn't called or come home since the gala, and that she supposed she'd deal with that once the deal closed and she had the bandwidth to care. Neither of them noticed that the fund's associate had stopped responding to calls as quickly as she used to. Neither of them thought to ask why Voss Capital's actual chairman, a man named Peter, whose name appeared nowhere on the letterhead, had never once been in the room. They signed Friday morning, in Timmy's office, with a bottle of champagne already chilling for the afternoon. Timmy signed with the confident flourish of a man closing a deal on his own terms. Enola signed beside him as a witness, mostly for ceremony, congratulating her father on saving everything he'd built. They toasted to survival. Somewhere across the city, in a glass office he now technically owned a controlling interest in, Yemi read the confirmation email and felt nothing resembling triumph, only the quiet, procedural satisfaction of a trap closing exactly as designed. The following Monday, Timmy and Enola arrived at the downtown office of Voss Capital Partners, expecting champagne and handshakes. The email invitation had described it as a closing celebration, a formality really, since the papers were already signed. Timmy wore his best suit. Enola wore the confidence of a woman who'd stopped worrying 3 days earlier and hadn't started again since. The receptionist directed them to a glass-walled boardroom on the 31st floor, considerably higher than any floor Timmy's own company occupied. Neither of them thought much of it. Distressed debt funds, Timmy had always assumed, liked to remind their clients who held the leverage. They didn't yet know how right and how differently that assumption would prove itself. 6 people were already seated at the long table when they walked in. 4 attorneys Timmy didn't recognize, the soft-spoken associate from the Gala, and, at the head of the table, a chair angled away from the door, facing the window. "They said the chairman wanted to meet us personally," Timmy whispered to Enola, straightening his tie. "Good sign." The chair turned. It took Enola nearly 3 full seconds to process what she was looking at, because the man sitting in the chairman's seat, in a suit considerably better than anything he'd worn in 6 years of marriage, was her husband. Timmy's expression moved through confusion, then denial, then something closer to vertigo, as if the floor itself had shifted degrees beneath him. "Yemi," he said, and the word came out smaller than he intended. "What? This isn't... You work in accounts receivable." "I worked in accounts receivable," Yemi said, and gestured for them both to sit, which after a moment neither of them fully controlled. They did. "For 6 years. Before that, I was the son of the man who owns this fund. I still am, actually. That part never changed." Enola's mouth opened, then closed. She was already reaching for the term sheet in her bag, flipping frantically toward Section 9, as if rereading it fast enough might rewrite what it said. "You'll find it's exactly what you signed," Yemi said, not unkindly. "Undisclosed covenant breach, material misrepresentation, full liquidation trigger. Your attorney should have caught it. He didn't. I made sure the timeline didn't give him much reason to look." Timmy's hands had gone still on the table, the posture of a man doing math he didn't want to finish. "You did this. You planned this. I flagged the covenant breach 8 months ago," Yemi said, "in writing. You told me to focus on my workload and let the adults handle strategy." He let that sit for a moment, unhurried, the way his father might have. "I've been an adult this whole time, Timmy. You just decided I wasn't worth listening to." Enola, finally finding her voice, said his name, softly, the way she used to, when she wanted something from him. It was, Yemi noted with something almost like sadness, the first time she'd said it like that in years. "Save it," he said, and slid a folder across the table. "There's a second one in there for you." Timmy opened the folder with the reluctant slowness of a man who already suspected what was inside and needed a few extra seconds before it became real. The first page was a formal notice of termination, effective immediately, citing gross misconduct, specifically, the material misrepresentation he'd made in failing to disclose the liquidity covenant breach prior to executing the agreement. Below it, a second document outlined the forfeiture of his golden parachute, the severance package he'd quietly written into his own contract, years earlier, as insurance against exactly this kind of outcome. The misconduct clause voided it entirely. "You can't do this," Timmy said, though the words came out thinner than he intended, more question than statement. "I built that company. 22 years. You built a company on projected revenue from developments that were stalled in zoning," Yemi said, "and refinanced it against thresholds you hadn't met in 2 consecutive quarters. I didn't do that. You did. I just declined to keep covering for it." He nodded to one of the attorneys, who slid a second, thicker document across the table. A full accounting of the misclassified liabilities, the reclassified short-term debt, the board minutes Timmy had never expected anyone outside his own circle to read carefully. It was, Yemi knew, more thorough than anything the audit committee had ever seen, because he'd compiled most of it himself, months ago, in a memo Timmy had never finished. "Your equity is being valued at 0, Yemi continued, "per the liquidation clause you signed Friday morning. Not because we're being punitive, because that's what the covenant breach actually triggers, and you certified, in writing, that there wasn't one." Timmy's face had gone the color of old paper. He looked, for the first time in the 6 years Yemi had known him, genuinely small, not powerful, not commanding, just a man realizing the room he thought he owned had never really been his. Security arrived at exactly the moment Yemi had arranged for them to, escorting Timmy out with the practiced, impersonal courtesy reserved for executives on their way out of buildings they used to run. He didn't fight it. There was nothing left to fight with. Yemi turned to Enola before she could stand. "There's a folder for you too," he said, and gestured to the associate, who set it in front of her. Thinner than her father's, but no less final. Enola opened it with hands that had started, almost imperceptibly, to shake. It wasn't a termination notice. It was a formal notification that her department, the marketing division she'd run for 3 years, largely funded by the very credit line now being unwound, was being dissolved as part of the company's restructuring, effective at the close of business. "You're not being fired," Yemi said. "There's simply nothing left for you to run." Enola looked up at him, searching his face for some trace of the man who used to apologize for things that weren't his fault, who used to absorb her father's contempt without comment, who used to come home and say nothing about any of it. She didn't find him. He wasn't in the room anymore. Enola sat very still for a moment, the dissolved department notice trembling slightly in her hands, and Yemi watched her do the math he'd already finished days ago. Her father was gone. Her position was gone. The only thing left standing at the table, technically, was her marriage, and she reached for it, the way people reach for the last solid thing in a room that's collapsing. "Yemi," her voice cracked slightly on the second syllable, "we can figure this out. Whatever this is, whatever you've become, we're still married. That still counts for something." "It does," Yemi said. "That's why I brought you a second folder, not just one." He nodded, and the associate slid a final document across the table, thicker than the others, bound, with a cover page Enola recognized immediately, even upside down. A divorce petition, already drafted, already notarized, waiting only for her signature to move forward uncontested. "There's a prenuptial agreement attached," Yemi said. "The one your father's attorney drew up before the wedding, at your insistence, to protect your family's assets from a man he assumed would never amount to anything. It's ironclad. It was always ironclad. It just happens to work in the opposite direction now." Enola stared at the document without opening it. "You planned this, all of it, down to the prenup." "No," Yemi said, and for the first time that morning, something in his voice softened, not with forgiveness, but with something closer to exhaustion. "I didn't plan any of this. 6 years ago, I wanted an ordinary life. I wanted to be loved for nothing in particular. You and your father made that impossible, long before I made any of this happen. I just stopped protecting you both from the consequences of who you actually were." She didn't sign it there at the table. She took it, wordlessly, the way people take things they know they can't refuse, and Yemi didn't ask her to hurry. He stood, buttoned his jacket, and looked once around the glass boardroom, at the empty chair where Timmy had been sitting 20 minutes earlier, at Enola staring down at a folder that ended 6 years of pretending, at his father's attorneys quietly gathering their laptops as if this was simply another Monday. For Peter, it was. For Yemi, walking out of the room and toward the elevator that would take him back up to the executive floor his father had been saving for him since before he was born, it was something else entirely. The first Monday in 6 years where he hadn't had to shrink himself to fit into somebody else's idea of who he should be. He didn't look back. There was nothing behind him worth the trouble.